May 10, 1994. Stateville Correctional Center. As the lethal chemicals began to flow, a witness asked the condemned man if he had any last words. He leaned forward, his voice devoid of remorse, laced only with contempt. He uttered 3, "Kiss my ass." This was the final unrepentant act of John Wayne Gacy. But to truly understand the horror, you must not look at the monster on the gurney. You must look at the man the world thought they knew. A successful contractor, a Democratic precinct captain who once had his picture taken with the First Lady, a beloved local figure who delighted sick children in hospitals, his face painted with the wide, reassuring smile of Pogo the Clown. He was the man next door. He was a pillar of the community. And beneath the floorboards of his quiet suburban home, he had built a private graveyard. This is not just a story about a killer. It's a story about the terrifying veil of normalcy. It's about the ease with which evil can wear a friendly mask. How did a man who brought laughter to children become a predator who hunted them in the shadows? And how, after decades, does the ghost of his crimes continue to redefine our deepest fears about who we can truly trust? Welcome to our investigation. If you find value in stories that seek to understand the darkest corners of the human psyche, consider subscribing. Our journey begins now. Every monster was once a child. John Wayne Gacy was born in Chicago on March 17, 1942, into a world rebuilding itself, full of the promise of the American dream. But inside the Gacy home, a private war was being waged. A shadow loomed over his childhood in the form of his father, an alcoholic whose validation John desperately craved but never received. Instead, he endured a relentless torrent of physical and verbal abuse. He was told he was stupid, a failure, and that he would never amount to anything. This constant humiliation became the toxic soil in which the seeds of a deep, pathological rage were planted. As a young man, John did not rebel in the traditional sense. Instead, he channeled his immense insecurity into a fanatical pursuit of the one thing his father denied him: respectability. He became a master architect of a flawless public image. He was the ambitious businessman, founding his own successful contracting company. He was the dedicated community man, a rising star in the local Democratic Party, charming his way into the orbits of power. He married, had children, and bought a home in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the very picture of stability. But beneath this carefully constructed fortress of normalcy, a dark current was running. In 1968, while living in Iowa, the first crack appeared. He was convicted of sodomy for coercing a teenage boy. He served 18 months before being granted parole, a model prisoner who convinced everyone he was reformed. He returned to Chicago, a little quieter, a little more truthful. He began perfecting his ultimate disguise, the friendly, harmless neighborhood clown, even as the pressure behind the mask was building to a catastrophic breaking point. The performance of his life was about to begin, and the stage was being looked for a horror no one could have ever imagined. Between 1972 and 1978, the mask of John Wayne Gacy was now fused to his face. By day, he was the affable contractor, shaking hands, closing deals, and volunteering as Pogo the Clown. But by night, he became a predator. His hunting ground was the streets of Chicago. His prey were the young and the vulnerable, runaways, hustlers, boys looking for their first job. He offered them work, a drink, a place to stay. His home on Summerdale Avenue became a spider's web, and the lure was the promise of a better life. Once inside, the friendly host would vanish. The doors were locked. The trap was sprung. Gacy's methods were a chilling blend of manipulation and brutal force. He would often perform a magic trick with handcuffs, a cruel parody of his clown persona, only for the victim to realize too late that the cuffs were real and there was no escape. What followed was a ritual of torture and assault, a final horrifying exertion of the power he had been denied his entire life. He silenced them forever with a length of rope, a technique he called the tourniquet trick. Afterward, he would meticulously clean up, shower, and often sleep, sometimes for hours, with the body of his victim still in the house, before consigning them to the silent, suffocating darkness of the crawl space beneath his feet. For 6 years, the earth beneath his home held its terrible secret. Boy after boy simply vanished. But on December 11, 1978, Gacy made his final fatal mistake. His target was 15-year-old Robert Piest, a clean-cut boy who worked at a local pharmacy. Piest went to speak with Gacy about a potential summer construction job. He was never seen again. Unlike many of Gacy's previous victims, Robert Piest had a loving, stable family who immediately raised the alarm. The investigation began, and for the first time, the relentless spotlight of suspicion fell directly on John Wayne Gacy. Detectives placed him under 24-hour surveillance. They watched his every move, their presence a constant, unnerving reminder that his world was shrinking. The pivotal breakthrough came when they searched his trash. They found a pharmacy receipt for film processing, a receipt that belonged to Robert Piest. They now had proof the boy had been with Gacy. On December 21st, armed with a search warrant, investigators entered the house at 8213 West Summerdale Avenue. The air inside was thick, heavy, and sweet, with the undeniable stench of decay. The lead detective, a veteran of countless grim scenes, would later say it was a smell he would never forget. They brought in a team with shovels. They began to dig. The trial, which began in early 1980, was a media circus. Gacy's defense team argued he was insane, a victim of multiple personality disorder. They claimed an alter ego named Jack was the real killer. But the prosecution painted a different picture, that of a meticulous, cunning, and highly organized predator who had expertly managed a double life for years. Gacy himself had confessed to 33 murders, even drawing a map for investigators, showing where each body was buried. One by one, the skeletons were unearthed from his suburban charnel house, 28 from the crawl space, 1 from beneath the garage, and 4 more recovered from the Des Plaines River. The jury saw through the performance. After deliberating for less than 2 hours, they delivered their verdict: 33 counts of murder. The sentence was death. The confrontation was over. The long wait for justice had begun. The guilty verdict was not an end, but the beginning of a long, finalter chapter. For 14 years, John Wayne Gacy became a resident of Menard Correctional Center's death row. The world outside moved on. Seasons changed, and the boys he had murdered receded further into memory for some. But for Gacy, time became a flat circle, measured not in days, but in the slow grinding machinery of the appellate court system. He was no longer a hunter. He was a caged spectacle, a celebrity monster. And from behind bars, he began a grotesque new career. He started to paint. His subjects were varied: landscapes, Disney characters like the Seven Dwarfs. But his most famous and most chilling works were of clowns. Specifically, self-portraits as Pogo, the very disguise he had used to lure a community into a false sense of security. These canvases, signed by the notorious killer, became sought-after items in a macabre corner of the art world. Some saw it as a desperate attempt at therapy, others as a final, twisted performance, a way to profit from his infamy, and continued to manipulate the world from his cell. He was still hiding behind the painted smile, taunting society with the very image of the innocence he had destroyed. As his appeals ran out, the date was set, May 10th, 1994. The day began with the rituals of state-sanctioned death. For his last meal, Gacy requested fried shrimp, French fries, a pound of strawberries, and a Diet Coke. A strangely mundane menu for a man whose appetites had led to such unspeakable horror. It was a final taste of the ordinary world he had forfeited forever. He spent his final hours talking with his lawyers and family, calm and collected, as if preparing for a business trip rather than his own execution. There was no confession, no tearful apology, no last-minute plea for forgiveness for the families of the 33 young men whose lives he had stolen. At the Stateville Correctional Center, he was strapped to a gurney. The process was clinical, methodical. A chemical mishap with the IV line caused an unexpected delay, drawing out his final moments for an agonizing 18 minutes. Witnesses, including some of the victims' family members, watched from behind a glass pane. Through it all, Gacy remained silent, his face a blank mask. When the warden officially asked for his last words, the mask finally dropped. It wasn't a plea to God. It wasn't a message to his family. It was a final sneer of defiance at a world he felt had wronged him. Kiss my ass. At 12:58 a.m., John Wayne Gacy was pronounced dead. The monster's heart had stopped beating. But the resolution was not a moment of triumph or peace. For the families, it was the end of a legal battle, but not the end of their pain. For society, the death of the man did little to kill the terrifying questions he left behind. The physical body was gone, but the ghost of the killer clown was just beginning its long, dark life in the American psyche. The execution of John Wayne Gacy did not bury his story. It immortalized it. His legacy is not found in the legal texts or the trial transcripts, but in the cultural shadows he cast. Before Gacy, the clown was a figure of innocent joy, of circus tents and children's parties. After Gacy, that image was forever fractured. He weaponized trust. He turned a symbol of laughter into a mask for pure evil, birthing the archetype of the evil clown that now permeates our horror films, our literature, and our collective nightmares. This, perhaps, is his most profound and lasting act of terror, the poisoning of a universal symbol of happiness. The physical legacy of his crimes was also a source of deep, unresolved pain. Even after his conviction, the identities of 8 of his victims remained a mystery. For decades, they were just numbers, nameless boys resting in unmarked graves. This created a second agonizing ordeal for their families, a purgatory of not knowing, a grief without a name to mourn. It wasn't until the advent of modern DNA technology, decades after Gacy's death, that investigators could begin the painstaking process of finally putting names to the nameless. One by one, cold cases were reopened. DNA was matched, and families who had lived in limbo for a generation were finally given the certainty of their loss. This ongoing forensic saga serves as a powerful reminder that Gacy's violence did not end with the last shovelful of dirt. Its shockwaves continue to ripple through time. And what of Gacy himself? Did he ever feel a flicker of remorse? In his 14 years on death row, he maintained his innocence to some, confessed to others, and often blamed the victims, claiming their lifestyles put them in harm's way. He never offered a coherent single truth. His final words, "Kiss my ass," were not just an act of defiance. They were his closing argument. They were the ultimate expression of his pathological narcissism, a final declaration that his world, his grievances, and his ego were all that mattered, even at the very edge of eternity. He felt he was the victim. The 33 boys in his crawlspace were merely inconvenient footnotes in the tragic story of John Wayne Gacy. His house on Somerdale Avenue, the suburban tomb he had so carefully constructed, was demolished in 1979, erased from the earth as if to cleanse the ground it stood on. But you cannot demolish a memory. The Gacy case forced America to confront an uncomfortable truth, that monsters do not always lurk in dark alleys or haunted houses. Sometimes they live next door. Sometimes they are pillars of the community. And sometimes they wear a painted smile. He taught us that the most terrifying darkness is often the one that hides in plain sight, and that is a lesson society has never been able to unlearn. The story of John Wayne Gacy is, in the end, a labyrinth of unanswered questions. We know what he did in horrifying detail. We know how he did it. But the ultimate question, why, remains locked away in the silence of his grave. Was he a product of a violent childhood, a damaged soul warped by abuse? Or was he simply born without a conscience, a predator in human form? Can we separate the man from the monster? Or were they always one and the same? His case forces us to look at the very nature of evil itself. Is it a force that descends upon us, or a seed that grows within us? When Gacy put on the clown makeup, was he hiding his true self, or was he revealing it? The chilling possibility is that Pogo the Clown and John the Killer were not two separate identities, but two sides of the same terrible coin, one designed to attract, the other to destroy. This is where the historical record ends, and our reflection must begin. Justice, in the legal sense, was served. John Wayne Gacy paid for his crimes with his life. But does the execution of a man like him truly bring closure? Or does it simply end one chapter of pain while leaving the deeper wounds of trauma and fear to fester for generations? Can a society ever truly heal from a scar this deep? These are not easy questions, and there are no simple answers. The purpose of revisiting these dark histories is not to sensationalize, but to understand, to learn, to remember the victims, and to perhaps become more vigilant about the darkness that can hide behind the most ordinary of smiles. What do you think? Was justice truly served in this case? And what does the story of John Wayne Gacy teach us about the masks people wear in our own communities? Share your thoughtful opinions in the comments below. Let's engage in a respectful and meaningful discussion. If this story brought you value and gave you something to reflect upon, please consider sharing it. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the heart of darkness.